Welcome. I'm Rusty, a private investigator. Join me on Truth in Shadows as we embark on a journey to uncover the truth together. Let's dive into the mysterious and expose the hidden realities. The calm before the storm. The hidden struggles. In the quiet town of Minnesota, Lois Riess appeared to live an idyllic life. To those around her, she was simply a sweet grandmother, someone who had spent decades raising her family and now spent her days spoiling her grandchildren. Lois seemed like the epitome of a loving wife and devoted mother, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. But beneath this facade of normalcy, there was a darker side to Lois, one that few would ever know. For years, Lois struggled with a deep, dangerous addiction: gambling. It started as a harmless escape, something to do when she felt bored or anxious. But over time, it became more than just a passing hobby. It was a compulsion. Her desire to win, to feel the thrill of the game, soon consumed her. The small trips to local casinos turned into frequent visits, and what had once been a manageable distraction became an all-consuming obsession. Lois's addiction had led her to devastate her family's finances. Her husband, David Riess, had worked tirelessly to provide for their family. He had always been the steady one, the provider, the protector. But as Lois's gambling problem worsened, the cracks in their financial situation began to show. David had started noticing the discrepancies in their savings, the unpaid bills, and the unexplained withdrawals from their bank accounts. Lois would brush off his concerns, claiming she just needed a little more time to turn things around. David didn't know it at the time, but Lois had already racked up massive debts at various casinos and was constantly borrowing money to feed her addiction. She was drowning in debt, but she couldn't stop. Every time she won, even the smallest amount, it was enough to fuel her desire to gamble even more. And every time she lost, the compulsion to try again grew stronger. The cycle was endless, and Lois felt trapped. At the same time, David began to sense something was wrong in their relationship. The woman he had married had become distant, almost like a stranger. Lois had become secretive about her finances, and her temper was growing shorter. She had always been an emotional person, but now her outbursts were more frequent, and she became defensive when David asked questions about their money. He could see the toll that gambling had taken on her, but Lois refused to admit it. Instead, she blamed everything on bad luck, on external forces, never accepting responsibility for her actions. David's frustration grew as Lois continued to promise that everything would improve, only to see her fall deeper into the pit of addiction. They fought constantly, their relationship strained by her secrecy and the financial pressures. Lois had always been the one who handled the finances, and now, with David taking a more active role, she felt her control slipping away. She resented him for trying to take control of something she felt was hers. She started to feel suffocated, angry, and scared. Scared of losing everything, including the one thing that still seemed within her grasp, her control over the situation. But Lois wasn't just worried about losing her financial security. She was afraid of losing her freedom. The addiction had become so all-encompassing that she couldn't imagine life without it. And more than anything, she wanted to escape from the crushing weight of it all. She was starting to feel like she couldn't outrun the debt, the lies, and the overwhelming guilt. As David pushed for more transparency and began to question her more about their financial issues, Lois began to panic. She could see no way out. The weight of her actions, her secret debts, the lies to her husband, the crushing pressure, was too much for her to handle. Lois realized that her life, as she knew it, was on the verge of unraveling. The only way out, it seemed, was to remove the obstacles in her path. David had always been the one trying to fix things, trying to make their life better. But Lois now saw him as an obstacle, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. As she saw it, he was standing in the way of her freedom, standing in the way of her getting back to winning again, even if that meant using him as a means to an end. She began to contemplate darker thoughts, thoughts that she had never considered before. What if David wasn't around? What if the debts could be erased, the freedom could be reclaimed, and she could start fresh? Lois realized that this might be the only way to save herself from the destructive path she had created. She could take control again, and she wouldn't have to worry about David's interference anymore. The thought started to grow stronger in her mind, and it became more than just a fleeting idea. Lois was no longer just thinking about the gambling. She was thinking about eliminating the person who stood between her and the life she wanted. It was the beginning of a dark and twisted journey for Lois Riess. The woman who had once been a loving wife and grandmother would soon be transformed into a ruthless criminal. A woman willing to do anything to escape the life she had trapped herself in. The tension builds. As the days passed, Lois Riess's life seemed to be slipping further into chaos. Her marriage to David, once built on trust and mutual respect, was now riddled with suspicion and resentment. The financial burden of Lois's addiction to gambling was becoming too much to bear, and David's growing concern only made Lois feel more trapped. She couldn't hide the truth any longer. She was drowning in debt, and the weight of it was suffocating her. David had always been the calm one, the steady presence in their relationship, but even he was starting to reach his breaking point. Lois had become more defensive and aggressive during their arguments. Every time David mentioned the increasing debts or the lack of payment on their bills, Lois would either lash out in anger or retreat into silence, unable or unwilling to confront the truth. The tension between them grew, and it was evident to anyone who spent time with them that something was deeply wrong. But Lois wasn't just fighting with David. She was fighting with herself. She knew she had become a stranger in her own life, a woman consumed by a need she couldn't control. She had become someone she barely recognized. The gambling had taken away everything that had once mattered. Her peace of mind, her sense of self, and now, even her relationship with David. Desperation had taken hold of her. David began to ask more pointed questions, pressing Lois about where the money had gone, how the bills were getting paid, and why there were so many missing checks. Lois found herself increasingly cornered. Every time she tried to cover up the truth, her lies grew more tangled. But she couldn't stop. The addiction, the need to gamble, was all-consuming. It became her way of escaping the suffocating reality of her life. One evening, after yet another argument about their financial troubles, Lois sat in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. David had gone out to run errands, and for the first time in weeks, Lois was alone with her thoughts. The realization hit her hard. She was running out of time. She couldn't keep hiding the truth, and she couldn't keep up the charade. Something had to change. Her thoughts began to spiral. The idea that had only flirted in the back of her mind for weeks was now at the forefront of her mind. What if she could just get rid of David? What if she didn't have to face the consequences of her addiction? What if she could just erase everything and start over? She had spent years in this marriage, but now, all she could see was the financial mess and the restraint he represented in her life. If David were gone, she could have everything she wanted: freedom, money, and the chance to escape the prison she had created for herself. Lois's heart raced as the thoughts began to feel less like fleeting fantasies and more like a plan. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She had access to David's life insurance policy, and his bank accounts were an open door to everything she needed. If she could somehow get rid of him, the debts would disappear, and she would be free to live the life she always dreamed of. The more she pondered it, the more it made sense. The idea took root in her mind, and it was no longer just a thought, it was a solution. But there was one major problem: David. Lois knew he would never just disappear without a fight. He would never agree to leave her or allow her to escape their financial troubles. He had always been a fighter, and Lois knew that the only way out would be if he were gone. She would have to take matters into her own hands. But there was also a darker realization. The longer she waited, the more desperate she would become. And Lois didn't know how much longer she could keep up the pretense of a happy marriage. As the days dragged on, Lois grew more agitated. Every time David asked about the finances, every time he suggested she stop gambling, she saw him not as the man she had loved for years, but as a barrier, a roadblock standing between her and everything she wanted. Her resentment began to simmer to the surface. She didn't just resent him for his concern or his attempts to control their finances. She resented him for being a reminder of her failure, for being a part of the life she had ruined. The breaking point. The evening of March 5th, 2018, brought a storm of emotions. Lois and David were once again embroiled in a heated argument. This time, it was over the missing money and unpaid bills. David, increasingly suspicious of Lois's behavior, finally confronted her about the truth. His questions were no longer gentle. They were accusatory, urgent. He demanded to know where the money had gone and why she had continued gambling despite the mounting debts. Lois's anxiety flared, and she could feel the walls closing in. The pressure of the situation, the weight of the lies, and the constant fear of being found out overwhelmed her. She snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. The resentment she had built up over the years, toward David, toward herself, toward her addiction, came to a head. David's voice was firm as he demanded an answer, but Lois could barely hear him over the pounding in her ears. She was trapped. Her desperation for escape, for freedom from the chains of debt and addiction, became so overpowering that in the heat of the argument, she felt like she had no choice. She couldn't let him control her anymore. She had to take control. In one swift, violent motion, Lois crossed the line. With trembling hands, she reached for the gun she had hidden for just such a moment. In the heat of the argument, David didn't see it coming. The gunshot rang out, breaking the tension in an instant. David collapsed, and Lois stood over him, stunned by the finality of her action. The silence that followed was deafening. Lois had crossed a line she could never return from. The deed was done, and Lois was left with the realization that her life would never be the same. The breaking point. Lois stood frozen, staring at her husband's lifeless body on the floor. The sound of the gunshot still rang in her ears, a sharp, jarring noise that would forever echo in her mind. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She never imagined that her feelings of frustration, anger, and desperation would culminate in murder. But now, in the cold silence of the room, there was no turning back. The man who had once been her partner, her husband, lay dead at her feet, and Lois was left with nothing but the grim reality of her decision. For a moment, Lois didn't know what to do. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly backed away from David's body. The world outside seemed distant, muffled. Time slowed, and for a split second, she wondered if she had made a grave mistake. But the fear was overwhelming, and the moment of hesitation quickly passed. This was the escape she had been longing for, and there was no room for second thoughts. Her mind began racing, considering the consequences. Lois quickly realized she needed to act fast. There were no more chances. She couldn't risk being caught, not now, not when she had already come this far. Every decision she made now would shape her future, for better or for worse. The immediate aftermath. Lois knew she had to cover her tracks. The first step was to make sure the crime looked like an accident, an unfortunate outcome of their argument, something that could be easily explained away. She had planned this moment for months, and she knew what she needed to do. With trembling hands, Lois wiped down the gun and placed it back in its hiding spot. She carefully cleaned up the small bits of blood that had splattered onto the walls, working quickly to remove any traces of her involvement. David's body was heavy, and moving him was a difficult task. Lois struggled, but she managed to drag him to the hallway, out of sight, before returning to the living room. She straightened the furniture, made sure no obvious signs of struggle remained, and turned the TV on, creating a semblance of normalcy. If anyone walked into the house now, they would see nothing but a peaceful, lived-in home. Then, she placed a phone call to the police. She kept her voice steady as she reported that David had fallen while they were arguing, that the whole thing was an accident. Her words were carefully measured, each sentence designed to make the incident seem like a tragic mistake. The police would believe her, wouldn't they? She had no reason to think they wouldn't. There was no evidence to suggest anything else, right? As Lois sat back down on the couch, waiting for the authorities to arrive, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The overwhelming pressure that had plagued her for years, the weight of debt, and the suffocating grip of her addiction had finally been lifted. Now she was free. She could start over. The money, the insurance, the assets, all of it would be hers to claim. Lois Riess would no longer be burdened by the past. The days after, the following days passed in a haze. Lois carefully maintained her story when the police arrived and began their investigation. She described the argument, the fall, and how she had tried to help David but was unable to save him. The officers, who initially seemed skeptical, ultimately accepted her story. There was no sign of foul play, and no one suspected a thing. Lois was, for the time being, in the clear. But even as Lois breathed a sigh of relief, the weight of her crime continued to gnaw at her. There was no joy in the freedom she had gained, no sense of peace. Instead, she felt a deep, uneasy emptiness. Lois was no stranger to lying and hiding the truth, but this was different. She had taken a life, David's life, and there was no turning back. But the guilt didn't matter, at least not right now. She needed to keep going. The next steps were clear. She immediately began to act as though nothing had changed. Lois continued to manage their finances, taking over David's bank accounts and ensuring that all their debts were paid off, using the insurance money she knew she would soon receive. She went through the motions of mourning, playing the part of the grieving widow for their friends and family, never letting anyone see the coldness inside her. However, Even though Lois tried to maintain her composure, the tension was palpable. There was a constant, gnawing fear that she would be found out, that her carefully constructed lies would eventually unravel. She had watched too many true crime documentaries, read too many stories about women who had been caught after their perfect crime. Lois knew she had to act quickly. There was no room for error. As the days passed, Lois began to devise her next move. She had plans, and she was going to carry them out no matter what. She knew she needed to leave the town, escape before anyone could raise any suspicion. She would leave everything behind, start fresh in a new place, with new people, under a new identity. The growing paranoia. But as Lois packed up her things, a feeling of paranoia began to settle in. The police had not closed the case yet. Although they hadn't found anything suspicious, Lois knew that things could turn on a dime. What if the investigators decided to look deeper? What if someone came forward with more information? Her fear grew, but she forced herself to push it aside. She had made it this far, and there was no going back now. On March 10, 2018, just a few days after the murder, Lois put her plan into motion. She used David's credit cards to withdraw large sums of cash, knowing that the police would soon be looking into financial transactions. She used his car and began to drive, heading south, hoping to leave behind any trace of her involvement. The escape. After Lois Riess made the fateful decision to end her marriage to David, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. The weight of the crime she had committed pressed heavily on her chest, but the urge to escape, to rid herself of the life that had so consumed her, was overpowering. The murder had been only the beginning. Now Lois had to put her plan into action, disappear, leave behind the wreckage of her past, and begin a new life. She began by securing David's assets, his bank accounts, credit cards, and the life insurance policy she had claimed as her own. She knew she couldn't just leave everything behind. The money she would receive from his life insurance was her ticket to freedom. But first, she had to ensure that no one could trace her movements, no one could connect her to David's death. She had to cover her tracks. The first steps toward freedom. Lois quickly packed a few of her belongings, including clothing, identification, and a few personal items that would help her create a new identity. She withdrew money from David's bank accounts using his cards, knowing the police would eventually look into any unusual activity. But at this point, Lois felt a surge of confidence. She was too far gone now to turn back. She had already made her choice, and there was no other option but to continue moving forward. She knew she couldn't stay in Minnesota. It was too risky, and David's family would begin to ask questions soon enough. The police would start digging deeper into the case, looking into his finances, speaking to his friends, and retracing his final days. Lois needed to be far away from any possible connection to the murder. She had to leave the state. She had to make sure that no one could tie her to David's death, and for that, she needed a fresh start. With David's car, she began her journey south. Lois was careful, not drawing attention to herself. She used cash for everything, avoiding any use of credit cards that might be traced back to her. Her first destination was Florida. It wasn't a place she had any particular connection to, but it was far from Minnesota, and it offered the perfect opportunity for her to disappear among the crowds. The new identity. As Lois made her way to Florida, she began to think about the next step, how to cover her tracks completely. She had already taken David's car and used his money to fund her journey, but she knew she would need more than just money to stay hidden. She couldn't afford to use any of her own personal accounts or identification. She had to assume a completely new identity. Once she arrived in Fort Myers Beach, Lois rented a room at a Marina Village motel. She paid in cash and made sure to register under a fake name. She had done this before, using alias names to avoid being traced in the past, but this time, it felt different. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Everything had to go according to plan. Over the next few days, Lois spent her time watching her surroundings, learning the area, and planning her next move. She went about her days as if nothing had changed, playing the role of a harmless, unassuming woman in her mid-50s, just another tourist looking for a fresh start. But the truth was much darker. Lois was a woman on the run, a woman who had just committed murder and was determined to get away with it. It didn't take long for Lois to meet someone. One evening, while visiting a local bar, she struck up a conversation with a woman named Pamela Hutchinson. The two hit it off immediately. They shared drinks, exchanged stories, and by the end of the night, Pamela had invited Lois back to her hotel room. Lois felt a sense of opportunity. It wasn't that she was particularly interested in Pamela. It was simply that Lois saw in her an easy mark, someone she could befriend, gain trust from, and perhaps even use to further her escape. But Lois had to be careful. She couldn't reveal too much. Her goal was to blend in, to play the role of a woman who had no ties, no past, and no reason for suspicion. She had already made her way to Florida, and now she had to make sure that no one would recognize her. No one would realize the woman they were talking to was a fugitive. The growing paranoia. As Lois continued to travel and meet new people, the paranoia began to build inside her. She was constantly on edge, worried that someone might recognize her, that something would go wrong. She couldn't afford to make a mistake, but she could feel the pressure mounting. Every face seemed suspicious. Every phone call felt like it could be a trap. Her addiction to gambling still loomed over her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. But now her focus was solely on surviving, on staying hidden. It was during this time that Lois made an attempt to cover her tracks further. She used Pamela's identity, pretending to be Pamela when making hotel reservations, and using Pamela's credit card to withdraw more cash. She felt it was the perfect opportunity to continue moving under the radar. The more she blended into Pamela's life, the less likely anyone would connect her to the murder she had committed. However, even though she was being careful, Lois couldn't completely suppress the gnawing feeling that she was being watched. Every time she interacted with someone, she found herself overthinking, wondering if her false identity would be discovered. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions. The search intensifies. Back in Minnesota, David's family had reported him missing, and the authorities began their investigation into his disappearance. Lois knew it was only a matter of time before they started connecting the dots. The police were already questioning those who knew David, and with the missing person report filed, they would inevitably turn their attention toward Lois. But Lois had a head start. The police had no idea where she was or who she had become. She continued to move, always staying one step ahead. She knew that time was running out. Every new day, the risk of getting caught grew, but Lois had made her decision. She would not be caught. The investigation begins. As Lois Riess made her way through the quiet streets of Fort Myers, the sound of police sirens echoed in the background, a constant reminder that the web of deception she had woven was beginning to unravel. What Lois had hoped would be a fresh start, an escape from the consequences of her actions, was slowly turning into a game of cat and mouse. She had no idea that her every move was being tracked, every detail scrutinized. Back in Minnesota, Lois's husband, David Riess, had been missing for days. His family, initially unsure of what had happened, became increasingly concerned. David had never just disappeared without a word, and when his body was finally discovered in their home on March 23, 2018, everything started to change. It wasn't long before investigators began questioning those closest to David, and soon, Lois found herself at the center of an investigation she thought she had cleverly avoided. The Dodge County Sheriff's Office in Minnesota was the first to begin piecing together the circumstances surrounding David's death. Their initial assumption was that David's passing was a tragic accident due to a fall. However, something about the scene didn't sit right. The position of his body, the lack of blood spatter, and the chillingly low temperature in the room raised red flags for investigators. The house, though well kept, appeared to have been disturbed. It didn't take long for them to rule out natural causes. Then the autopsy came in. David had multiple gunshot wounds in his torso, indications that his death was deliberate, not an accident. The police dug deeper into his background and the state of his relationship with Lois. They uncovered financial records showing large withdrawals from their joint bank accounts and signs of increasing tension between the couple, especially regarding Lois's gambling habits. The deeper they looked, the more they uncovered. Lois's secret addiction to gambling had pushed her into debt, and her desperation to get out of it was a clear motive for murder. It wasn't long before investigators turned their attention to Lois, especially when they learned of her disappearance shortly after David's death. The evidence was starting to paint a clear picture. Lois had planned and executed the murder, and now she was on the run. The search for Lois. The search for Lois Riess began immediately. Authorities reached out to local law enforcement and federal agencies, including the U.S. Marshals, in an attempt to track down the fugitive. Meanwhile, Lois was already several hundred miles away in Florida, hiding under a false identity, using David's stolen money to fund her escape. She had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, using David's car, credit cards, and documents to mislead investigators. Back in Minnesota, The police began looking into Lois's recent activities, uncovering surveillance footage of her at various locations, including gas stations, motels, and even casinos. Lois's love for gambling didn't stop with David's death. It was just another way for her to reassure herself that she was still in control. It wasn't long before investigators learned that Lois had checked into a Marina Village motel in Fort Myers, Florida. Surveillance footage showed Lois arriving alone and registering under an alias. The officers were now certain they were on the right track. The authorities began to piece together Lois's movements over the past several days. They learned that she had contacted her family, pretending to be mourning David's sudden death. But what was more chilling was the discovery of phone records that suggested Lois had been in contact with people from David's life, including his business partners, shortly before the murder. She had orchestrated the crime meticulously, and now, she was making her escape to the last place anyone would expect: Florida, far from the place where David's family and the authorities were beginning their investigation. The critical breakthrough. As the search for Lois intensified, investigators began to find crucial pieces of evidence in Florida. On April 6, 2018, just a few days after Lois had checked into the Marina Village motel, a local resident contacted the authorities. They had seen Lois in the area and recognized her from the news reports that had circulated about the missing woman. The tip-off was invaluable, and it prompted police to track her down immediately. They went through the surveillance footage from the hotel, where they saw Lois in the company of another woman, Pamela Hutchinson. The two women were seen interacting over the course of a few days. Lois had befriended Pamela, and was even seen leaving the hotel with her on April 5, just hours before Pamela's death. Investigators now had their first solid lead. Lois had been in the company of Pamela Hutchinson, who had seemingly vanished by the morning of April 6th. The discovery that Pamela's body had been found days later in a nearby motel room raised further suspicion. There were significant signs of foul play, and the authorities quickly connected Lois to this crime. They also found that Pamela's credit cards were being used by Lois, which suggested she had stolen Pamela's identity in an attempt to cover her tracks and avoid detection. The final confrontation. The investigation had reached its tipping point. After weeks of pursuing Lois Riess across state lines, authorities were closing in. Lois had carefully planned every step of her escape, but even the most meticulous plans have cracks. The relentless work of the Dodge County Sheriff's Office, U.S. Marshals, and Florida authorities had paid off, and Lois's days on the run were numbered. The breakthrough came on April 19, 2018, when a routine check of local surveillance footage in South Padre Island, Texas, revealed something crucial. Lois's stolen vehicle, Pamela Hutchinson's white Acura, was spotted near a restaurant. This was the moment the authorities had been waiting for. Lois, in an attempt to blend in and continue her escape, had made the mistake of staying in one place for too long, and her movements were now under surveillance. The Dirty Owl's restaurant, a popular spot near the Mexican border, became the site of the final confrontation. Lois entered the restaurant, seemingly unaware of the growing dragnet around her. As she walked through the door, she was seen by a sharp-eyed employee who recognized her from the news coverage about the fugitive. This individual immediately alerted the police. Lois, ever the opportunist, tried to leave the restaurant as quietly as possible, but the jig was up. The chase begins. As soon as the authorities were alerted, local officers sprang into action. They knew they had Lois in their sights, but they also knew she was a desperate woman who might resist arrest. The officers quickly coordinated with the U.S. Marshals and Texas Rangers. A few minutes later, they had tracked Lois's vehicle to a nearby parking lot. Lois had been seen entering and leaving the establishment, but now she was in danger of being cornered. Officers surrounded the lot, carefully moving in on Lois. However, Lois was no fool. She wasn't going to be caught without a fight. She attempted to flee again, this time in Pamela's car. The police followed her closely, hoping to prevent her from disappearing once more. The pursuit was intense, but Lois's panic was palpable. She had been on the run for weeks, and she knew that her capture was inevitable. As she sped through the quiet streets of South Padre Island, officers tried to cut her off, but Lois was determined to escape. She drove recklessly, ignoring traffic signals, and narrowly avoiding collisions with pedestrians and other vehicles. Her desperation pushed her beyond reason. The fact that she had already taken 2 lives didn't seem to slow her down. She was willing to do whatever it took to avoid the inevitable. The arrest. At 8:25 p.m., just as Lois tried to exit the parking lot, Her escape route was blocked by multiple police cars. Surrounded and caught, Lois had no choice but to pull over. Officers surrounded her vehicle, weapons drawn, demanding that she exit the car and surrender. For a moment, Lois hesitated. Then, she slowly opened the door and was arrested without further incident. As she was placed in handcuffs, Lois's demeanor was almost eerily calm. She showed no signs of aggression or resistance, but there was something cold in her eyes, an emotionless, almost defeated look. Lois Riess, the woman who had committed 2 brutal murders and led the authorities on a multi-state manhunt, had finally been caught. The arrest was met with a mixture of relief and revulsion. To those who had followed the case, it was the conclusion of a harrowing search. But for Lois, the fight was far from over. She was taken into custody, and as the officers led her away, she was silent. In that moment, Lois Riess was no longer the woman on the run. She was a criminal, her fate sealed. The aftermath. Once Lois was arrested, investigators worked quickly to piece together the full scope of her crimes. They gathered the evidence they had accumulated over the past few weeks, including surveillance footage, phone records, and financial transactions, all of which pointed to Lois's involvement in both murders. Lois's confession came soon after her arrest. During her interrogation, she revealed the full extent of her plan. She admitted to the murder of David Riess, claiming that it had been a desperate act, born out of financial troubles and her gambling addiction. But when questioned about Pamela Hutchinson's murder, Lois was less forthcoming. She refused to explain why she had killed Pamela, though investigators believed it was an act of opportunism. Pamela had become another casualty in Lois's escape, someone she could easily use to cover her tracks. The most chilling part of Lois's confession was the lack of remorse. She didn't express regret or sorrow for her actions. Instead, she seemed detached, almost indifferent to the lives she had taken. To Lois, the murders had simply been necessary steps in achieving her own freedom. The courtroom drama begins. After Lois Riess's arrest in South Padre Island, Texas, she was quickly extradited to Florida, where she would face charges for the murder of Pamela Hutchinson. At the same time, authorities in Minnesota had already filed charges against Lois for the murder of her husband, David Riess. What started as a search for a missing person quickly became a national spectacle, with the media covering every step of Lois's arrest and upcoming trial. The woman who had once been a seemingly ordinary grandmother was now labeled a cold-blooded killer, and the public was eager for answers. Lois's trial was set to begin on October 12, 2018, and it promised to be a tense and dramatic affair. The prosecution was prepared to argue that Lois had carefully orchestrated her husband's death, driven by financial desperation and a compulsive gambling addiction. The murder of Pamela Hutchinson, they argued, was a calculated attempt to cover her tracks and maintain the illusion of innocence as she fled the scene. They planned to demonstrate that Lois had used Pamela's identity in an attempt to hide her involvement in the crimes and evade capture. On the other side, Lois's defense team would try to argue that her actions were the result of extreme emotional distress. They planned to focus on her gambling addiction and the pressure it placed on her life, hoping to present her as a woman who, in a moment of crisis, had lost control. They would attempt to paint Lois not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a victim of her circumstances, someone who had been pushed too far. The courtroom was filled with tension as Lois entered, her face betraying no emotion. The once adoring public who had watched her arrest in South Padre Island now viewed her with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. The victims' families, David's relatives and Pamela's friends, sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief and anger. The trial had become a battle not just for justice, but for closure. Prosecution's case. The prosecution's opening statement was powerful and clear. They painted Lois as a woman who had carefully planned both murders to remove the obstacles standing in her way. The argument was straightforward. Lois had been drowning in debt due to her gambling, and David's increasing suspicion of her activities had become intolerable. According to the prosecution, she could no longer live the double life she had created. Her lies, her debts, her secrets were catching up with her, and the only solution she saw was David's death. Prosecutor Martin Caldwell began by outlining the timeline of events leading up to David Riess's death. He presented the evidence, the gunshot wounds, the gunpowder residue found on Lois's hands, and the financial records showing large withdrawals from their bank accounts, all pointing to Lois's desperation to cover up the financial ruin she had caused. They didn't stop there. The prosecution continued by detailing Lois's actions after David's murder, including her manipulation of Pamela Hutchinson. Lois had befriended Pamela, used her credit cards, and even impersonated her, all while fleeing the law. The prosecution's case painted Lois as cold, calculating, and willing to destroy anyone who got in her way. The most damning piece of evidence came when they revealed Lois's confession during the interrogation. Lois, after being read her Miranda rights, had admitted to killing David in an act of desperation. The chilling part of her confession was the apparent lack of remorse. She described the murder as if it were simply a necessary step in her escape. Prosecutor Caldwell argued that Lois had murdered Pamela in the same cold manner, seeing her as nothing more than a means to an end. Pamela's death was an act of opportunism, another victim caught in Lois's web of lies. The defense's case. The defense team, led by attorney Bethany Reynolds, presented a starkly different view of Lois's actions. They argued that Lois had been under severe emotional and psychological distress, compounded by her gambling addiction. Reynolds claimed that Lois's addiction had clouded her judgment and led her to make irrational decisions. In her opening statement, Reynolds spoke about Lois's life before the murders. She painted a picture of a woman who had once been kind-hearted, a devoted mother and grandmother, but who had become a victim of her addiction. The defense tried to humanize Lois, highlighting her deep-rooted struggle with gambling, which they claimed had stripped her of any sense of control. Reynolds also pointed out Lois's relationship with David, that it had been rocky for years, and David's increasing demands for control had only exacerbated the situation. According to the defense, Lois had felt cornered and trapped by David's accusations. In this context, the defense presented the murder of David as a crime of passion, a moment when Lois lost control after being pushed too far. The defense team also suggested that Lois had not intended to kill Pamela Hutchinson. Instead, they argued, Pamela's death was a tragic accident. Lois, in her attempt to cover her tracks, had been unable to handle the overwhelming guilt and confusion surrounding David's murder. Pamela had become a scapegoat, an unfortunate casualty of Lois's escape plan. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's claim that Lois had planned both murders with cold deliberation. Instead, they sought to portray Lois as someone who had been overwhelmed by addiction and despair, incapable of understanding the full scope of her actions. They argued that Lois was not a psychopath, but rather a woman who had been pushed beyond her limits by a life of secrecy, lies, and addiction. The verdict. After days of testimony, the courtroom was filled with tension as the jury deliberated. The families of both David and Pamela sat in silence, waiting for the final decision that would determine Lois's fate. Would she be convicted of both murders, or would the defense's arguments about her addiction and emotional distress sway the jury? Finally, the jury returned with their decision. Lois Riess was found guilty of second-degree murder for the killing of her husband, David Riess. The jury acknowledged the significant influence of Lois's gambling addiction, but ultimately they determined that she had acted with malice and deliberation, making the murder intentional. For the murder of Pamela Hutchinson, Lois was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury concluded that Lois had intentionally killed Pamela, using her as a pawn in her escape plan. Lois was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read aloud. The families of the victims, who had spent months in agony waiting for justice, were finally able to feel a sense of closure. Facing the consequences, after Lois Riess was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, her world, once full of lies and desperate escapes, came crashing down. For the first time since her arrest, Lois was forced to confront the full scope of her actions. The brutal reality of what she had done, killing her husband, David, and the innocent Pamela Hutchinson, began to settle in. Prison life was nothing like the freedom she had once known, and it was clear to Lois that she had traded her old life for a life sentence that she could never escape. The walls of her cell were cold and impersonal, and the stark, unyielding environment of the Shakopee Women's Prison was a far cry from the life Lois had once led. The days began to blur together, morning routines, harsh warden commands, and the dull ache of loneliness. Lois found herself haunted by her thoughts. The guilt that she had long avoided was now inescapable. She could no longer hide from herself. Her once unshakable confidence had been replaced by a growing anxiety. Lois spent most of her time reflecting on the murderous path she had chosen. What had driven her to such extreme lengths? Her mind often wandered back to the moment she pulled the trigger on David, to the chilling emptiness in his eyes as she took his life. She had felt no remorse at that moment, only a need to escape. But now, in the silence of her cell, the weight of her actions crushed her. She had convinced herself for so long that she was justified, that David's death had been the only way to escape her crushing debt and gambling addiction. But as she sat in the quiet of her prison cell, Lois realized that no amount of justification could undo the harm she had caused. The guilt was palpable, suffocating her every thought. The guilt settles in. Lois's emotional turmoil didn't end with her conviction. It had only just begun. The act of murder had taken a toll on her, not only on her conscience but also on her psyche. Lois began to suffer from disturbing flashbacks, her mind replaying the images of David's lifeless body and the moment she pulled the trigger. These memories came crashing back at night, sometimes in the form of nightmares, sometimes in the form of quiet, creeping thoughts that would not leave her alone. The emotional numbness she had felt in the moments following the murder was fading, and now she was left with the harsh reality of her actions. Lois had always managed to compartmentalize her emotions, keeping her addiction, her lies, and her guilt at bay. But in prison, there were no distractions, no opportunities to gamble her way out of her feelings. She had nothing but time, and that time was spent in self-reflection. She often thought about Pamela Hutchinson, the woman she had killed in a moment of desperation. Unlike David, Pamela had been an innocent bystander, caught up in Lois's plan to cover her tracks. Pamela's family had lost a beloved member to Lois's cruelty, and Lois could no longer ignore the enormity of the devastation she had caused. Her thoughts were interrupted when she began receiving letters from the families of her victims. David's sister, whom Lois had always thought of as a kind woman, wrote her a letter filled with raw emotion, recounting the pain Lois had caused her family. The words were harsh but honest, and Lois found herself unable to respond. She couldn't defend herself anymore, and she knew that no words could undo the harm she had caused. From Pamela's family, Lois received a letter expressing their anguish and disbelief. The letter was short, but its words cut deep. They didn't ask for an explanation. There was none that could suffice, but they made it clear that they could never forgive Lois for taking someone they loved from them. The letters piled up, each one a reminder of the lives she had destroyed. Lois felt the walls close in as the guilt settled deeper inside her. The isolation was suffocating, and she knew that no matter how many letters she received, how many apologies she might offer, it would never be enough. She had taken 2 lives, and the weight of that was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Facing the mirror, months passed, and Lois's routine in prison became predictable. She took part in the daily activities, such as the mandatory classes, counseling sessions, and exercise time. But there was no escape from herself, no way to outrun the consequences of her actions. Lois knew she would spend the rest of her life locked away behind bars, and she was left to grapple with the person she had become. During one of her counseling sessions, Lois was asked to confront her emotional numbness. The prison psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Thompson, who had been assigned to Lois's case, was patient but firm. She encouraged Lois to talk about the emotions she had buried deep inside. Lois hesitated but eventually gave in, starting with the small things: her growing frustration with David, the mounting debt, and the pressure of keeping up appearances. But as the session progressed, Lois began to speak about something darker. She spoke of the emptiness she had felt after the murders, the sense of power she had experienced at the time. She described how, at that moment, she had felt in control, able to make the decisions that would free her from the shackles of her life. Dr. Thompson listened quietly, nodding as Lois continued to speak. But the psychologist didn't let Lois off the hook. She gently reminded Lois that her feelings of power and control were short-lived. Eventually, Lois had been forced to face the reality of what she had done. Lois began to reflect on the consequences of her actions in a way she hadn't before. She acknowledged that her addiction had played a large part in the crimes she committed. But it wasn't just the addiction. It was the way she had lost touch with her own morality, the way she had been willing to hurt others to save herself. By the end of the session, Lois had a breakthrough. She realized that she had been running from herself for years, and now, in the stark reality of prison, there was no more running. The woman in the mirror was a stranger to her, a woman capable of cruelty, deception, and manipulation. But more than that, she was a woman who had destroyed her own life in the pursuit of selfish desires. Lois knew that facing the mirror, truly understanding who she had become, was the first step toward any kind of redemption. But deep down, she understood that redemption might never come. The damage had been done. The lives she had ruined could never be brought back. And Lois had no choice but to live with that knowledge. A life behind bars. Lois Riess's days in Shakopee Women's Prison had become routine, yet each day felt like a year. With no way to escape from the consequences of her actions, she spent her time reflecting, looking back on the series of decisions that had led her to this point. Life inside prison was harsh and unyielding, but it gave Lois something she had never truly had before: time to think. Time to reflect. Time to feel the weight of her choices. Her cell was stark, nothing more than 4 walls, a metal bed, and a small desk where she spent hours writing in her journal. Writing had become Lois's only way of processing her emotions, her guilt, her anger, and the deep emptiness she felt inside. Writing was where she confronted her thoughts, her sins, and the woman she had become. Revisiting the past. One morning, while sitting at her small desk, Lois opened a letter from her lawyer. It was a standard letter, updating her on the status of her case, but for some reason, it struck a chord with her. It was a reminder that she would never be free again. Lois closed her eyes and took a deep breath, allowing herself to process the reality that she had no way out. Her life sentence, without the possibility of parole, meant she would die in prison, and that realization was both a relief and a curse. She had been running for so long, hiding from herself, hiding from the truth. But now, in the silence of her prison cell, she was forced to face the truth head-on. As the days went by, Lois began to revisit the moments that led her to this dark place. She thought back to the day she had killed David Riess, her husband. She remembered the argument, the rising tension between them, and how, in that moment, she had felt a sense of power, the decision to take his life feeling like the only way to regain control. The shame, however, came later, in the silence of her cell, after the adrenaline had worn off, and the guilt began to seep in. Lois thought about Pamela Hutchinson next. Pamela had been a stranger to her, but she had become an unwitting pawn in Lois's escape plan. Lois couldn't understand why she had murdered Pamela. She had no personal vendetta against her. It was simply a tragic decision, one made in a moment of fear and desperation. Lois began to wonder about Pamela's life. What had she been like? What dreams had she had before Lois had taken them away? For the first time, Lois acknowledged the horrific nature of what she had done. The realization hit her like a wave. She had taken the life of someone who had done nothing wrong, simply because it was convenient for her. Confronting the mirror. As Lois continued to reflect, she found herself standing in front of the small mirror in her cell. She stared at her reflection, studying the face that had once been filled with confidence and charm, a face now marred by the years of lies and crimes she had committed. The woman in the mirror was unfamiliar to her. She didn't recognize the cold, hardened eyes that stared back at her, and for the first time, Lois felt the absence of her own humanity. The woman in the mirror was a killer, a woman who had destroyed her own life and taken the lives of others in the process. There was no hiding from this woman. There was no escaping her. Lois Riess had become a monster, and the truth was inescapable. For a long time, Lois had denied responsibility for her actions. She had blamed her addiction, her financial struggles, and her relationship with David for her descent into crime. But now, with no one else to blame, she had to face the fact that she had made these decisions of her own volition. No one had forced her to murder David. No one had forced her to kill Pamela. She had chosen this path. Lois took a deep breath, struggling to hold back tears. She was empty, but she was also full of regret. She knew that no apology would bring back the lives she had taken. She would never be able to undo the damage she had caused, and no amount of remorse would change her fate. Lois's realization was painful, but it was the first step toward understanding who she had become. As the days passed, she began to find some measure of peace in this acceptance. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, but she had finally come to terms with the fact that she could never escape her past. Her time was over. In a moment of clarity, Lois wrote a final letter to the families of her victims, David's family and Pamela's family. She had never written to them before. In fact, she had been too terrified, too ashamed to face them. But now, after months of reflection, Lois felt a deep need to apologize, to express the sorrow she could never fully make up for. In the letter, Lois owned up to her actions. She didn't try to justify her choices. She simply said, "I am sorry. I can never undo what I have done. I cannot make up for the pain I caused, but I wish I could. I wish I had the chance to change things, but I don't. All I can offer is my regret." Her words were sincere, but they felt inadequate. She knew she would never be forgiven. But this letter, written in the quiet of her cell, was the only thing she could give back, a small acknowledgement of the lives she had ruined. Lois ended the letter with one final thought: I have lost everything. And now, I am just trying to find a way to live with myself. Lois Riess had become infamous. Her name had been plastered across headlines, her face a mugshot that defined her as the killer grandma. The story of her two brutal murders, the killing of her husband, David Riess, and the murder of Pamela Hutchinson, an innocent woman caught in Lois's web of lies, had captivated the nation. The media portrayal of Lois as a woman who had stolen 2 lives and tried to escape her past resonated with the public, leaving a lasting impression. But for Lois, it was a far more personal journey. While the world knew her as a cold-blooded killer, her inner turmoil continued to grow. Behind bars, Lois began to realize the extent of her infamy. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a symbol of betrayal, greed, and desperation. Her actions had shattered lives, and as she reflected on her time in prison, Lois found herself wondering if she would ever be able to live down the legacy she had created. The impact on the families. Lois knew she would never be able to erase the pain she had caused. David's family, who had once embraced her as a member of their own, now saw her as a traitor. His sister, in particular, had been vocal in her disgust at Lois's actions. Their family had been torn apart by Lois's decisions, and there was no way to undo the suffering they had endured. Pamela's family, too, had been left reeling. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend, and all for nothing, simply because Lois had chosen to murder her to cover her tracks. Pamela's parents, in particular, struggled to come to terms with the senselessness of the crime. They often wondered what they could have done to prevent her tragic death. Lois knew they would never get the answers they needed. Lois couldn't help but think about Pamela's life, the woman she had taken away. Had Pamela been happy? What dreams did she have that would never be fulfilled? Lois realized that she would never truly understand the depth of the pain she had caused by taking Pamela's life. No apology, no remorse would ever bring her back. It was a realization that haunted Lois in her prison cell, living with the legacy. As the months passed, Lois's reputation only grew. The media continued to sensationalize her story, turning her into an example of a woman gone astray. Some viewed her as a product of her circumstances, a woman pushed to the edge by addiction and financial ruin. Others saw her as a cold, calculating criminal who had murdered her way through life. In the public eye, Lois was a cautionary tale, someone who had taken the wrong path and never looked back. But for Lois, the public's perception didn't matter. What haunted her was the legacy she would leave behind, a legacy of regret and devastation. She realized that she would never be able to undo what she had done. The family she had destroyed would continue to suffer long after she was gone. The pain of her actions would echo through the years, and Lois would never be free of it. In the quiet moments of her prison life, Lois found herself grappling with the fact that her legacy was one of death and destruction. There would be no redemption, no coming back from the choices she had made. She had become a woman who had destroyed her own life and the lives of those around her. Facing the end, Lois knew she would never leave prison. Her sentence was life without the possibility of parole, and even if she were to somehow make it out, she would forever be tainted by her crimes. She had no family left to return to, no friends, no community. Her only purpose now was to survive the days, living with the knowledge that she had chosen to take 2 lives and had irreparably damaged everyone she once cared about. But there was a part of Lois that had begun to accept her fate. She had been given the opportunity to reflect, to come to terms with who she had become. The process wasn't easy, and it didn't bring her peace, but it allowed her to accept that she could never change the past. In the quiet of her cell, Lois understood that she had made her bed and now had to lie in it. The legacy of Lois Riess would not be one of forgiveness, but of remorse. She had murdered her way out of a life she didn't want, and in doing so, had lost everything she had ever valued. Now she could only look at the man in the mirror, the woman who had become a symbol of selfishness, betrayal, and greed. Lois Riess's legacy was not one that could ever be undone, no matter how much she regretted her actions. Lois began to wonder about Pamela's life. What had she been like? What dreams had she had before Lois had taken them away? For the first time, Lois acknowledged the horrific nature of what she had done. The realization hit her like a wave. She had taken the life of someone who had done nothing wrong, simply because it was convenient for her. Confronting the mirror. As Lois continued to reflect, she found herself standing in front of the small mirror in her cell. She stared at her reflection, studying the face that had once been filled with confidence and charm, a face now marred by the years of lies and crimes she had committed. The woman in the mirror was unfamiliar to her. She didn't recognize the cold, hardened eyes that stared back at her, and for the first time, Lois felt the absence of her own humanity. The woman in the mirror was a killer, a woman who had destroyed her own life and taken the lives of others in the process. There was no hiding from this woman. There was no escaping her. Lois Riess had become a monster, and the truth was inescapable. For a long time, Lois had denied responsibility for her actions. She had blamed her addiction, her financial struggles, and her relationship with David for her descent into crime. But now, with no one else to blame, she had to face the fact that she had made these decisions of her own volition. No one had forced her to murder David. No one had forced her to kill Pamela. She had chosen this path. Lois took a deep breath, struggling to hold back tears. She was empty, but she was also full of regret. She knew that no apology would bring back the lives she had taken. She would never be able to undo the damage she had caused, and no amount of remorse would change her fate. Lois's realization was painful, but it was the first step toward understanding who she had become. As the days passed, she began to find some measure of peace in this acceptance. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, but she had finally come to terms with the fact that she could never escape her past. Her time was over. In a moment of clarity, Lois wrote a final letter to the families of her victims, David's family and Pamela's family. She had never written to them before. In fact, she had been too terrified, too ashamed to face them. But now, after months of reflection, Lois felt a deep need to apologize, to express the sorrow she could never fully make up for. In the letter, Lois owned up to her actions. She didn't try to justify her choices. She simply said, "I am sorry. I can never undo what I have done. I cannot make up for the pain I caused, but I wish I could. I wish I had the chance to change things, but I don't. All I can offer is my regret." Her words were sincere, but they felt inadequate. She knew she would never be forgiven. But this letter, written in the quiet of her cell, was the only thing she could give back, a small acknowledgement of the lives she had ruined. Lois ended the letter with one final thought: "I have lost everything. And now, I am just trying to find a way to live with myself." Lois Riess had become infamous. Her name had been plastered across headlines, her face a mugshot that defined her as the killer grandma. The story of her two brutal murders, the killing of her husband, David Riess, and the murder of Pamela Hutchinson, an innocent woman caught in Lois's web of lies, had captivated the nation. The media portrayal of Lois as a woman who had stolen two lives and tried to escape her past resonated with the public, leaving a lasting impression. But for Lois, it was a far more personal journey. While the world knew her as a cold-blooded killer, her inner turmoil continued to grow. Behind bars, Lois began to realize the extent of her infamy. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a symbol of betrayal, greed, and desperation. Her actions had shattered lives, and as she reflected on her time in prison, Lois found herself wondering if she would ever be able to live down the legacy she had created. The impact on the families. Lois knew she would never be able to erase the pain she had caused. David's family, who had once embraced her as a member of their own, now saw her as a traitor. His sister, in particular, had been vocal in her disgust at Lois's actions. Their family had been torn apart by Lois's decisions, and there was no way to undo the suffering they had endured. Pamela's family, too, had been left reeling. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend, and all for nothing, simply because Lois had chosen to murder her to cover her tracks. Pamela's parents, in particular, struggled to come to terms with the senselessness of the crime. They often wondered what they could have done to prevent her tragic death. Lois knew they would never get the answers they needed. Lois couldn't help but think about Pamela's life, the woman she had taken away. Had Pamela been happy? What dreams did she have that would never be fulfilled? Lois realized that she would never truly understand the depth of the pain she had caused by taking Pamela's life. No apology, no remorse would ever bring her back. It was a realization that haunted Lois in her prison cell, living with the legacy. As the months passed, Lois's reputation only grew. The media continued to sensationalize her story, turning her into an example of a woman gone astray. Some viewed her as a product of her circumstances, a woman pushed to the edge by addiction and financial ruin. Others saw her as a cold, calculating criminal who had murdered her way through life. In the public eye, Lois was a cautionary tale, someone who had taken the wrong path and never looked back. But for Lois, the public's perception didn't matter. What haunted her was the legacy she would leave behind, a legacy of regret and devastation. She realized that she would never be able to undo what she had done. The family she had destroyed would continue to suffer long after she was gone. The pain of her actions would echo through the years, and Lois would never be free of it. In the quiet moments of her prison life, Lois found herself grappling with the fact that her legacy was one of death and destruction. There would be no redemption, no coming back from the choices she had made. She had become a woman who had destroyed her own life and the lives of those around her. Facing the end, Lois knew she would never leave prison. Her sentence was life without the possibility of parole, and even if she were to somehow make it out, she would forever be tainted by her crimes. She had no family left to return to, no friends, no community. Her only purpose now was to survive the days, living with the knowledge that she had chosen to take 2 lives and had irreparably damaged everyone she once cared about. But there was a part of Lois that had begun to accept her fate. She had been given the opportunity to reflect, to come to terms with who she had become. The process wasn't easy, and it didn't bring her peace, but it allowed her to accept that she could never change the past. In the quiet of her cell, Lois understood that she had made her bed and now had to lie in it. The legacy of Lois Riess would not be one of forgiveness, but of remorse. She had murdered her way out of a life she didn't want, and in doing so, had lost everything she had ever valued. Now she could only look at the man in the mirror, the woman who had become a symbol of selfishness, betrayal, and greed. Lois Riess's legacy was not one that could ever be undone, no matter how much she regretted her actions.